March 1978. Las Vegas, Nevada. The desert wind moved through the parking lots and neon corridors of a city that had spent decades reinventing itself. Long after midnight, the lights still burned across the strip. Casino floors remained crowded. Dice rolled across green felt. Slot machines echoed through smoke-filled rooms. To tourists, Las Vegas looked untouchable. A city of spectacle, a city of money, a city of dreams. But federal investigators had spent years discovering something very different. Behind the chandeliers and celebrity performers, another system had quietly taken shape. It operated far from public view, hidden behind executive offices and counting rooms, protected by silence, intimidation, and organized structure. For years, investigators would argue that portions of Las Vegas had become one of the most profitable organized crime enterprises in American history. And according to federal records, the men making fortunes often were not the men whose names appeared on casino ownership documents. They were somewhere else, watching, waiting, collecting. The story had started decades earlier. During the 1940s and early 1950s, Las Vegas was still becoming what it would eventually become. Gambling had been legalized in Nevada in 1931. The city remained small for years afterward, isolated in the desert and separated from major population centers. But organized crime figures had already recognized something. Legal gambling created possibilities, not merely for casinos, for control. In the years following World War II, figures connected to organized crime organizations across the country began taking increasing interest in Nevada operations. One of the most recognized names associated with early Las Vegas expansion was Benjamin Siegel. Siegel, a documented associate of organized crime networks tied to New York and national syndicate figures, helped develop the Flamingo Las Vegas in the mid-1940s. Popular culture later transformed Siegel into a near-mythological character. Reality was more complicated. Historians and investigative records continued debating details surrounding financing and influence, but one point became increasingly clear over time. Las Vegas attracted major criminal interest because it offered something rare: huge amounts of cash. And cash could disappear. By the 1950s and 1960s, mob influence expanded through different channels. Rather than direct ownership, federal investigations later focused on hidden interests and financial arrangements. The structure evolved. Street crime organizations operated visibly. Professional organized crime groups preferred distance, especially when money moved through casinos, because casinos generated extraordinary volumes of cash every day. Cash from gaming tables, cash from entertainment, cash from restaurants, cash from hotel operations. Thousands of transactions, millions of dollars. And according to later federal prosecutions, some of that money allegedly never entered official accounting systems. Investigators had a word for it: skimming. The process itself was straightforward. Money could allegedly be removed before official reporting and taxation procedures documented revenue. If money disappeared before records reflected it, proving theft became extremely difficult. And according to federal investigations conducted years later, Las Vegas became central to one of the largest skimming operations ever prosecuted. But the public knew almost nothing, because the men connected to these systems often stayed invisible. Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, different cities, different organizations. Yet investigators later concluded that multiple groups had interests connected to Las Vegas casino operations. Among the most important figures in this history was Anthony Spilatro. Spilatro was not a casino owner. He was not a celebrity. He rarely stood under bright lights. But according to federal investigations and later organized crime histories, he served a far different role: enforcement, control, protection of criminal interests. Born in Chicago in 1938, Anthony John Spilatro emerged from an environment deeply connected to criminal activity. By his early years, law enforcement reports already associated him with violence and organized criminal operations. Federal investigations and journalist Nicholas Pileggi later documented Spilatro's rise through the structure of the Chicago outfit. The outfit operated differently than some East Coast families. It maintained influence beyond Chicago itself. And according to federal records, Las Vegas represented one of its most important financial interests. By the early 1970s, Spilatro, arrived in Las Vegas. Officially, he appeared to be a businessman. Unofficially, investigators believed something entirely different. Federal authorities later described him as a representative protecting outfit interests inside the city. Not in theory. In practice, the timing mattered, because during this period, organized crime influence in Las Vegas was changing. The old image of mobsters publicly controlling casinos had become dangerous. Too visible, too obvious. Federal agencies had increased investigative efforts dramatically. New laws changed tactics. Among the most important developments was the passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly called RICO. The law gave prosecutors new tools. Instead of pursuing isolated crimes, investigators could target broader criminal enterprises, patterns, structures, organizations. For law enforcement, the implications were enormous. For organized crime groups, the danger increased, and federal agencies adapted quickly. Wiretaps expanded, financial investigations intensified, surveillance operations became increasingly sophisticated. Agents followed movement patterns, recorded meetings, tracked relationships, built timelines. The FBI had spent years studying national organized crime networks. By the 1970s, their understanding had become far more detailed than earlier generations of investigators possessed, and Las Vegas moved closer toward becoming a major battlefield. Still, the city projected confidence. Tourism increased. Hotels expanded. Celebrities performed nightly. Visitors arriving in Nevada saw wealth and entertainment. They did not see counting rooms. They did not see hidden interests. And they certainly did not see the fears growing behind closed doors. Because according to later investigations, internal tensions had already begun developing. Money creates loyalty. Money also creates conflict. The more revenue casinos generated, the more pressure emerged over who controlled operations and who received profits. And hidden systems create hidden disputes. Some conflicts appeared quietly. Others attracted attention. Investigators increasingly believed Las Vegas had become more than a gambling destination. It had become a critical financial engine for organized crime operations extending far beyond Nevada state lines. Millions of dollars allegedly moved through channels difficult to track. And somewhere behind those systems sat men who almost never appeared publicly. Men whose names rarely entered newspaper headlines. But federal agents kept seeing familiar connections, familiar meetings, familiar associations. As investigators assembled evidence piece by piece, they began suspecting that Las Vegas contained a criminal structure far larger than anyone outside law enforcement fully understood. The casinos looked legitimate. The lights looked permanent. The city looked unstoppable. But appearances can hide extraordinary things. Federal investigators would eventually argue that the real power structure of Las Vegas had operated partly in shadows. Not on casino floors. Not in hotel lobbies. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere quieter. And before long, those shadows would begin turning against each other. Because the city Las Vegas presented to tourists was not always the city investigators believed actually existed. Late 1970s. Las Vegas, Nevada. The casino floors never stopped moving. Cocktail servers crossed carpets patterned with impossible colors. Dealers worked through endless hands of blackjack. Roulette wheels spun beneath chandeliers. Thousands of visitors walked beneath neon signs without ever noticing what investigators believed was happening beyond public view. Because the most important rooms inside many casinos were not on display. They sat behind locked doors, restricted spaces, counting rooms, places where currency moved faster than outsiders could imagine. Every casino generated enormous cash flow. Revenue arrived constantly and in different forms. Gaming tables, restaurants, entertainment venues, hotel operations. The money never stopped. And according to federal investigations that later led to major prosecutions, portions of that money allegedly disappeared before entering official records. Investigators called it the skim, not because cash vanished randomly, because money was allegedly removed before accounting procedures documented its existence. That distinction mattered. Once revenue entered formal reporting systems, regulators and tax authorities could examine records. Audits could compare numbers. Investigators could follow paper trails. But cash removed beforehand became far harder to trace. Federal authorities later concluded that this process operated through hidden networks involving casino executives, organized crime figures, and intermediaries connected to criminal organizations outside Nevada. The mechanics varied, but the objective remained simple: remove money quietly, move elsewhere, leave little evidence. According to later court proceedings and FBI investigations, casinos including the Stardust Resort and Casino, the Fremont Hotel and Casino, the Hacienda Resort Hotel and Casino, and the Marina Hotel and Casino later became central subjects in federal investigations surrounding alleged skimming operations. On paper, ownership structures often looked legitimate. Reality, investigators argued, looked very different, because federal agents increasingly suspected that influence stretched far beyond Nevada. Kansas City, Chicago, Milwaukee. The names surfaced repeatedly, and one figure continued appearing near the center of concern: Anthony Spilotro. By this point, Spilotro had become a powerful presence inside Las Vegas. Not publicly, not officially, but investigators believe his position extended beyond ordinary criminal activity. According to later reporting and federal evidence, Spilotro functioned as a representative protecting Chicago outfit interests tied to Las Vegas operations. Protection carried multiple meanings: monitoring loyalty, resolving disputes, maintaining discipline, and ensuring money reached intended destinations. Las Vegas was not simply another city. For the outfit, investigators believed it represented a financial artery, a stream of revenue that required control. Federal investigators increasingly associated Spilotro with a criminal organization later known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. The name came from investigative findings surrounding burglary methods. Rather than opening safes conventionally, members allegedly entered buildings by drilling through walls and ceilings. Direct, fast, unconventional. Law enforcement later connected the group to burglaries and theft operations throughout Las Vegas. According to reports and subsequent investigations, several individuals associated with Spilotro became linked to the crew. And as federal scrutiny intensified, concern inside organized crime circles reportedly increased as well. Because visibility created danger, attention attracted surveillance, and surveillance created records. Throughout the late 1970s, federal agencies expanded organized crime investigations aggressively. Agents conducted physical surveillance. Telephone monitoring increased. Financial inquiries widened. Patterns began emerging. Investigators no longer viewed organized crime purely through isolated arrests. They viewed it as infrastructure, relationships, networks, systems. RICO prosecutions had transformed investigative strategy. Instead of focusing solely on individual offenses, authorities aimed at enterprise structures themselves. That shift changed everything, because proving organization often mattered more than proving isolated acts. And prosecutors became patient, very patient. Meanwhile, tension inside Las Vegas reportedly continued building. Anthony Spilotro's public behavior increasingly drew attention. Investigative journalists and later historical accounts described concerns emerging among organized crime leadership. Las Vegas had always depended on controlled visibility, power without exposure, influence without spectacle. Spilotro reportedly operated differently. He attracted notice. Law enforcement noticed. Media noticed. Local figures noticed. And according to later accounts, people inside organized crime circles noticed as well. The concern was not theoretical. Attention threatened business. Federal agents had already begun assembling evidence from multiple directions. Casino investigations expanded. Financial records received scrutiny. Informants surfaced. And, perhaps most dangerous of all, hidden systems began developing fractures. Organized crime history repeatedly revealed one unavoidable truth. Large criminal enterprises often become vulnerable from within, not because of rival gangs, not because of police raids, because people talk. Associates become witnesses. Participants seek protection. Pressure changes loyalties. And federal authorities understood this. Investigators had spent years refining methods intended to create precisely that outcome. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the FBI increasingly focused on building cases through layered evidence. Surveillance alone rarely proved enough. Witnesses alone carried risks. Financial records told only part of the story. Together, however, separate fragments could become powerful. Agents assembled timelines, meeting locations, telephone records, travel patterns, connections between individuals. Eventually, investigators believed they were seeing a larger picture emerge. A structure linking hidden casino profits to organized crime organizations operating hundreds of miles away. But cases involving organized crime often move slowly, very slowly, because patience served investigators and time created opportunities. Inside Las Vegas, however, time created something else. Paranoia. The atmosphere changed. Federal pressure increased. Investigative reporting expanded. Regulatory scrutiny intensified. And according to later accounts, trust inside organized crime circles became increasingly fragile. People started wondering who was speaking, who was cooperating, who had become vulnerable, who had become dangerous. Because organized crime had always relied upon silence. Not legal contracts, not written agreements. Silence. And silence becomes harder to maintain when investigations tighten, particularly when money sits at the center of everything. Federal authorities later argued that millions of dollars had flowed through hidden channels connected to skimming operations. Millions. The numbers alone elevated stakes dramatically. Because larger money creates larger consequences. Failure becomes expensive. Exposure becomes catastrophic. By the early 1980s, pressure had reached levels difficult to ignore. Investigators moved closer. Evidence expanded. Questions multiplied. And for the first time in years, the hidden machinery behind Las Vegas appeared increasingly unstable. The city itself looked unchanged. Tourists still arrived. Performers still filled showrooms. The lights still illuminated the desert skyline. But underneath the spectacle, another reality had emerged. A financial system federal investigators believed had operated quietly for years now faced unprecedented scrutiny. And the men connected to it understood exactly what that meant. Because once federal investigations reached a certain stage, outcomes became difficult to stop. Files had already been assembled, surveillance already conducted, witnesses already interviewed. The process had started, and history suggested what often came next. Not celebration, not escape, indictments, betrayals, and eventually, consequences. Because Las Vegas had spent decades making fortunes in darkness, now investigators were preparing to turn on the lights. February 14th, 1979, Las Vegas, Nevada. The explosion shook windows miles away. At approximately 8 a.m., a massive blast erupted outside the Stardust Resort and Casino. Investigators later discovered that a bomb had been placed beneath a vehicle belonging to attorney and businessman Frank Rosenthal. Rosenthal survived. The explosion did not. Images from the scene showed twisted metal scattered across the pavement, smoke rising into the Nevada sky, emergency responders surrounding a destroyed automobile. Federal authorities never officially solved the bombing. No one was convicted. No definitive public conclusion ever established responsibility. But the attack intensified long-standing attention surrounding Las Vegas operations and individuals associated with organized crime investigations. Because Rosenthal had already become one of the most significant figures in the city's hidden history. For years, Rosenthal operated at the center of casino management connected to properties that later became subjects of federal investigations. Though Nevada regulators had denied him a gaming license, documented accounts and later investigations indicated he exercised substantial influence over casino operations. According to court records and reporting by investigative journalists, Rosenthal supervised activities at casinos tied to Argent Corporation interests. On paper, the structure appeared legitimate. Federal authorities believed something else existed behind it. Rosenthal's story did not begin in Nevada. Born in Chicago in 1929, he developed extensive connections to gambling operations before arriving in Las Vegas. Investigators later connected him to bookmakers and organized crime associates operating within larger criminal networks. Unlike traditional street-level figures, Rosenthal built influence through gambling expertise. Numbers, odds, operations, systems. According to documented histories and investigative reporting, he possessed extraordinary knowledge of sports betting and casino management. That made him valuable, extremely valuable, especially inside an environment where casinos generated enormous cash flow. But by the late 1970s, the environment surrounding Las Vegas had become increasingly unstable. Federal investigations expanded. Regulatory agencies increased pressure. Journalists pursued deeper reporting, and hidden conflicts reportedly intensified. The old structure depended upon distance, invisible control, limited exposure. Authorities increasingly believed that model was collapsing. Then investigators found another opening. Not through casinos, not through public operations, through people. Because major organized crime prosecutions often followed a familiar pattern. Someone eventually cooperated. Someone eventually talked. And over time, federal investigations identified witnesses and cooperating individuals capable of connecting separate fragments together. One of the most significant developments emerged through federal investigations involving hidden casino skimming operations tied to Midwest organized crime interests. Authorities assembled evidence over years: financial records, surveillance, witness testimony, travel documentation, meetings, patterns, small details becoming larger structures. Then federal prosecutors moved. The investigation became known publicly as the Strawman case. The name originated from allegations that hidden ownership and influence had operated through nominees and concealed relationships. According to federal prosecutors, individuals connected to organized crime families and criminal organizations used front arrangements to maintain influence over Las Vegas casino operations. The allegations reached beyond Nevada. Kansas City figures surfaced. Chicago connections emerged. Milwaukee interests appeared. Federal authorities increasingly described a coordinated structure involving skimming operations and hidden control. The case eventually produced some of the most important organized crime convictions involving Las Vegas. In 1986, multiple defendants faced prosecution in federal court. Among the most prominent names was Joseph Iappa. Also charged were figures including Nick Savella and other individuals connected to Midwest organized crime operations. Federal prosecutors alleged millions of dollars had been skimmed from Las Vegas casinos over extended periods. Court proceedings introduced evidence assembled across years of investigation. The verdicts represented a major victory for federal authorities. Convictions followed. Prison sentences followed. And for law enforcement agencies that had spent decades pursuing organized crime enterprises, the significance reached far beyond one case. The message became unmistakable. Traditional insulation methods no longer guaranteed protection. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. And organized crime structures that once appeared untouchable increasingly looked vulnerable. But another story remained unfinished. Anthony Spilatro. For years, Spilatro had served as one of the most feared figures associated with organized crime activity in Las Vegas. Investigators viewed him as an enforcer. Associates reportedly viewed him as dangerous. And according to multiple historical accounts, tension surrounding his role had continued increasing. By the mid-1980s, circumstances changed dramatically. Federal pressure mounted. The hole-in-the-wall gang investigation had generated arrests. Media scrutiny expanded. And according to later organized crime histories, concern reportedly developed among Chicago outfit leadership regarding exposure and visibility. Then came June 1986. Bensonville, Illinois. Anthony Spilatro and his brother, Michael Spilatro, disappeared. Days later, authorities made a grim discovery. Their bodies were found buried in an Indiana cornfield. Subsequent reporting and federal investigations linked the killings to organized crime retaliation. Years later, through testimony and investigations, authorities developed conclusions regarding responsibility connected to outfit figures. The murders represented something larger than two deaths. They reflected a pattern repeated throughout organized crime history. Internal systems often consumed themselves. Power shifted. Loyalties changed. Individuals once viewed as indispensable became liabilities. And liability inside organized crime carried consequences unlike those found elsewhere. Las Vegas itself entered another era. Corporate ownership expanded. Regulatory structures strengthened. Wall Street investment increased throughout subsequent decades. The city changed. Not overnight, not completely, but steadily. The old environment that federal investigators spent years pursuing gradually weakened. Large publicly traded companies replaced many earlier arrangements. Casino ownership structures transformed. Transparency became increasingly important. The transition did not erase organized crime from Las Vegas history. Nothing could do that. The influence had been too significant, too profitable, too deeply connected to the city's growth. Federal records, court proceedings, investigative reporting, and published histories all documented the extraordinary relationship between organized crime and the rise of modern Las Vegas. A relationship built on money, control, fear, and secrecy. Today, millions of visitors still walk the Strip every year. They pass beneath lights brighter than ever before. They enter casinos larger than anything earlier generations could imagine. Most never think about counting rooms. Most never think about federal surveillance teams. Most never think about hidden meetings taking place behind legitimate business structures. History tends to smooth rough edges. It turns violent realities into stories. Stories into legends. Legends into entertainment. But the documented history of Las Vegas tells a different story. Because behind the mythology stood real investigations, real prosecutions, real deaths, real people. Some went to prison. Some became witnesses. Some disappeared. Some never escaped the world they helped build. And that may be the darkest truth hidden beneath Las Vegas history. The casinos sold dreams. The city sold fantasy. But according to decades of federal investigations and court records, some of the fortunes that helped shape old Las Vegas came from a system built in shadows. A system that operated for years beyond public view. Until eventually, the lights became too bright.